All right, so we're going to do a class on Dostoevsky at the John David Ebert School for the Study of Culture, Cosmology, and the Arts. And the class begins actually tomorrow, March 8th at noon MST for those who are interested. And if you are interested in signing up to attend class live, the cost is $275. Just email me at johndavidebert@gmail.com. Or if you just want to subscribe to the classroom discussions, it'd be $150. Okay, so Dostoevsky was born in 1821 and he dies in 1881 at the age of 59. And so let's take a look at, I want to look at the background first of Russian literature, which really starts getting going with Pushkin. Alexander Pushkin, all kinds of poems and plays in different formats. This is really the first Russian novel. It's a novel in verse, though. He's borrowing the verse style from Byron's Don Juan to tell the story of this anti-hero, Eugene Onegin, who is a kind of a negative protagonist in that he's world-weary. As it opens up, he's in his, I think, his late 20s, maybe early 30s, and he's gone through the whole courtly society, attending opera and theaters and various soirees, schmoozing his way through the aristocracy. He himself is an aristocrat. And as he begins, though, it starts out like Faust, where he's completely bored, even though he's well-read, he's literate and well-educated, but he's bored with books. Not only that, he's bored with women, he's bored with high society, he's bored with everything. So he decides to leave the city of St. Petersburg to go out into the countryside to visit some friends. I think his uncle has a house out there, and by the time he gets there, his uncle is dying, but he goes out there to see him, and when he gets there, the uncle's dead. So he has the manor out there in the countryside, where he meets a couple of women, Olga and Tatiana, and they are sisters. Olga is the blonde and the extrovert. Her sister Tatiana is the brunette and the introvert. That's not accidental. It's the double goddess, the goddess of the daytime and the goddess of the night sky. So he befriends Tatiana, but he doesn't love her, although she falls madly, passionately in love with him. Meanwhile, he has a friend named Lenski who comes out into the countryside, who's about the same age and is much more, he takes books and learning much more seriously. He wants to write poetry. He studied philosophy. And he takes his culture very seriously. And he is betrothed to Olga. So Tatiana, who's fallen in love, pining away, I guess it's the attraction of the deep introvert with the shallow extrovert. That pair does normally attract each other pretty easily. And she writes him a letter, a passionate letter, declaiming her passions for him, sends it to him, and then she meets him in the road the next time he's pulling up in the main boulevard, and he spurns her. He gives her the letter back, and he's read it. Of course, he spurns her. And as the narrative develops then, Onegin makes the mistake at one of the dances of flirting with Olga, his best friend's betrothed. He flirts with her, and he takes that, Lenski takes it very seriously, and he challenges him to a duel. So he agrees, and they go out on the field, and he kills Lenski in the duel. And then he leaves, and years pass, and in that interim, as Onegin is out wandering around, Tatiana goes into his study in the manor where he had been staying in the countryside and reads all his books. She's the very brooding, introverted, lonely, Faustian type protagonist. Whereas Onegin, there's a deleted chapter that was going to show him in the meantime when he's out wandering. He goes from Petersburg to, I think, north to Kazan, and then down into the Caucasus, in Georgia there, down into Cyprus, into the Middle East, and into Turkey, and so forth. So that's more like what Spengler is talking about in his essay on the two faces of Russia, when he's saying there's an authentic Russia that's motivated by the symbol, of the metaphysical symbol of the flat plane that goes on forever and denies all forms of verticality. The Russian word for heaven is nebo, which with the letter N there denies. It's a negation of the sky. And so the deleted chapter had shown Onegin wandering on those travels, which is very much more closer to the Russian protagonist, who is a wanderer, no matter what situation he finds himself in, or herself in the case of Tatiana. whereas Johndavi takes on the form of the Faustian brooding hero. So there's the Russian pseudomorphosis there, the European pseudomorphosis on Russian forms, which takes Russia a while to work its way through and break down and disintegrate and dissolve it. And then so that's Pushkin. So the next important Russian writer is Lermontov, who wrote A Hero of Our Time. I think this is 1842. Now, Lermontov was a military man who was stationed down in the Caucasus Mountains. And so all the stories in this collection, and there are 5 of them, are set in that region where he writes about another anti-hero. It's interesting that all these Russian novels begin with anti-heroes. With a character named Pechorin, who's a military man who is capable of great deeds. He abducts a woman and takes her out with him onto the steppe, which is a sort of Siberian Mongolian iconotype of the abducted maiden, such as what you find in the 18 Songs of a Nomad Flute, which is a Chinese story written in the Tang Dynasty around 700 AD, but it's set in the Han Dynasty and details a woman being held captive. Does she fall in love with her captor or not? And in the case of Pechorin, she does. In the case of the Nomad Flute, she does not. But so we have his exploits, and this ends too with a duel. Lermontov was a huge fan of Pushkin and had communicated with him through the mail. Never met him though, and so they have a duel. And here again, the hero wins. Pechorin, the antagonist, is killed, pushed over the side of a cliff after he's shot, and they blame it on an accident when he gets back. But it's interesting that these 2 writers both themselves died in duels. They picture the main characters of their narratives both dying in duels. And then at age 37, Pushkin lost his life in a duel. And at age 26, same thing happened with Lermontov. That's kind of interesting how you have life imitating art, not the other way around. And then so we get to the most important of these for as far as influences on Dostoevsky go, and that's Gogol. Nikolai Gogol, Dead Souls primarily. He's got other things, some short stories, the important ones, and extremely important, The Overcoat and The Nose. Dostoevsky says all of Russian literature came out of The Overcoat because it concerns a bland, schlemiel type civil servant copyist who's in his 60s or 70s, and all the rest of the office workers make fun of him and his threadbare coat that he doesn't have enough money to purchase a new one. So because they're constantly ridiculing him, he saves up enough money, buys a new coat, and shows it off. And then on his way home from a party, the very party that was held to show off the coat, he's beaten and robbed, and the coat is stolen. And he dies from this, and then he comes back as a ghost, and he takes revenge on all the people who made fun of him. It's a fun story, and Gogol is a very, very funny writer. I think Dead Souls is one of the funniest novels I've ever read in my life. It's awesome. It's so good. I didn't want it to end. The pages just turned like a bestseller. And this concerns yet another anti-hero, Chichikov, who used to be a customs officer out on the frontier there somewhere, dealing with nobility coming up and quickly wanting a droshky to get here or there, and he has to supply them. And so Chichikov is a character who comes into this small town. We don't know what the name of it is. He just calls it Town N because it's meant to be symbolic or allegorical, rather, of any other Russian town. Everyone's like this in these Russian towns. And he's come up with this scheme to buy the names of dead serfs. So we have this kind of Russia is still feudalistic all the way down to the Emancipation Proclamation near the end of the 19th century under Alexander II. Russia has slaves, basically. They're called serfs, but they're the same thing as slaves. And the landowners have them. You usually have quite a few of them, anywhere from 30 to 100 or more, 400 maybe, depending on how much wealth the landowner has. So there's a census every 10 years. So the landowner has to list the legal names that they hold legal title to of their serfs, and then has to pay taxes on them. But a decade later, there will have been, inevitably, serfs who have died in the interim. But the landowner still owns their names legally. So Chichikov figures out a scheme where he goes around and he buys from the landowners the names, just the names of these dead souls, these dead serfs, because he knows that he can collect them all and then sell them to the bank for a mortgage. And so that's his scam. And the funny part consists in the fact that as he goes around talking to all the rich landowners who are more or less in control politically and economically of the town, each one is a very hilarious character, better than a type. Gogol is very good at imagining and coming up with a type and then adding three-dimensional eccentricities to the type. Very funny, very colorful. I highly recommend it, Dead Souls. Now, so in his first 7 years of creativity as a writer, which begins at age 21 for him and goes down to age 29, whereupon on his Saturn return at age 29, he's thrown into jail, into a gulag at Omsk in Siberia. But he has this first 7 years of creativity, and I want to focus on that here for this particular video as we're getting started with him. He is dealing with a Gogolian pseudomorphosis. And this happens with every great talent, whether be it an artist or a literary writer. You got to start somewhere. And so the normal procedure is to start by imitating one's mentor or one's master. And that's exactly what Dostoevsky sets out doing here. So he has this is his first novel, Poor Folk. Now this is written when he's 23 years of age, but he already was writing plays at the age of 21 and 22. 3 lost plays, Mary Stuart, his version of Boris Godunov. Pushkin had a version of that. And The Jew of Yonka or something like that, which is a riff off of Shylock from Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. But now with Poor Folk, he writes a novel, and it's a short one, only about 150 pages. It can be read in a single sitting, as I did. It's surprisingly good. Dostoevsky never wrote a bad anything. That's the thing. Even while he was groping around here in his early years. Thomas Mann did the same thing at age 23, 24 with Buddenbrooks, which was a huge hit across Europe. And then, just like Dostoevsky, with Poor Folk having been a huge hit in literary circles in Petersburg, they both had trouble following up the hits with a series of failed stories, or at least failed in the eyes of the literary critics. They're not failures. And until with Mann, he doesn't make his comeback until Death in Venice and The Magic Mountain, written closer to the age of 40. With Dostoevsky, it's a little bit different story. So Poor Folk, it's written in this epistolary style that became popular when the novel became popular in the 18th century with epistolary novels like Richardson's Pamela or Clarissa. They're writing letters back and forth. Or Goethe's novel that he wrote, that was his breakthrough at about the same age as Mann with Buddenbrooks and Dostoevsky with Poor Folk with the Sorrows of Young Werther, also written in an epistolary style. So the letters are going back and forth between two people, an older man who is a variation of the main character, Akaki Akakevich, in the overcoat, the Schlemiel civil servant. He's about the same age, he's in his 50s or so. And he has fallen in love with this girl across the street who's a teenager, 16 or 17 years old, something like that. And he takes he's not sure, he's confused, actually, as so often is the case in these kinds of May-December romances, whether he feels more fatherly towards her or more, he would rather be her lover. He gets conflicted, and she plays that up to the hilt. And he's very poor, he doesn't have much money. He's constantly borrowing money from people so that he can send it to her and buy her little treats, little sweets, and all kinds of things that he sends to her. And she, of course, is constantly, oh, you shouldn't have, but secretly, please do, keep it coming. And so this goes on for a while until she runs into an aristocrat named Baikov who offers to come in and buy her out, basically, and she wants the money. Turns out that was the only thing that she was interested in this relationship all along. So she leaves, and he never hears from her again. And the implication is that he's ruined, and he will drink himself to death, like the character in Pushkin's short story, The Station Master, who's a character, similar old age man who's living with his 16-year-old daughter out on the frontier at either a custom stop or a place where people would stop to trade coaches and droshkis and barushas and so forth. And he's living with the daughter, and then a military man comes in and sweeps her off her feet, leaves with her, absconds. This is the abduction motif that we find in mythology all over the world, whether it's Persephone picking flowers and being abducted by Pluto, or whether it's Sita, Rama's wife, plucking flowers, and then she's abducted by Ravana, the demon, who carries her off to Sri Lanka, and so forth. It's a very common motif at the end of the Station Master, and then so he loses his daughter and he drinks himself to death. And Dostoevsky alludes to that story in here. So, okay, so that's Poor Folk. It comes out, he's 23 years old, and he's the talk of the St. Petersburg Literary Circle. He's regarded as a genius just off this one novel. But then he has trouble following it up because with The Double, which is the next one, written right after it, and it's much more authentically Dostoevsky than the first one. Way much more so. It's very creepy, and he has a way of evoking an atmosphere of insanity. And it's kind of a caricatured novel. It's a little bit like the literary equivalent of German expressionist painting in the early part of the 20th century. It's kind of like that, where everything is a bit distorted, warped, and caricaturized, including this main character, Goliadkin, who's again another one of these clerkly civil servants, schlemiel guys. And he is extremely paranoid, unlike the character in The Overcoat. Dostoevsky does a wonderful job of evoking his mental illness, where he thinks everyone is out to get him. Very much like Kafka's The Trial, and I don't think that novel would exist if Dostoevsky had never written The Double. There's a lot of similarities. There's a very surrealistic quality to this as he goes from one situation to another, where he is literally the center of public ridicule. At one of the soirees at which he has not been invited, he finds himself standing in the middle of the room surrounded by a circle of everyone making fun of him. And so Dostoevsky really cranks up the paranoia knob on this story. He does a fantastic job. The character Goliadkin's speech patterns are very bizarre. He'll try to say something and get all tangled up and never really end up saying anything much. And then he goes through this process, and then his double shows up. And it's a little bit like, there's no explanation for it because this is literature. Such explanations need not apply, but sort of a little bit like The Nose in Gogol's short story, where a civil servant, in that case a county assessor, wakes up one morning and his nose is missing. He's just got a flat space there, not even a hole, just the nose in a flat space. Then he tracks it down, and later on he sees the nose in a carriage going along, dressed in a jacket. I think it's a military jacket with epaulets or something like that. It's very funny, imagining a giant nose walking around, and eventually he finds it and gets it back, and with some ironies, of course. So it's a little bit like that. You just don't question it. It's literature. You read it. It has nothing to do with whether this could happen or couldn't happen. Indeed, such droll minds who even raise that question shouldn't even be reading literature anyway in the first place. It's called a willing suspension of disbelief. This is why realism kills art. And these writers are not writing realism. Even if they tell you it's realistic, it isn't. It's all Russian metaphysics expressed through the false outer facade of realism. It is not. So this double shows up without explanation one night as Goliadkin is out coming home from work. It's late at night, and he's looking out over the Fontanka River. And then he sees a person coming towards him, and then he gradually realizes as he goes into his apartment building and up the stairs following this guy, and realizes that the guy's the exact same. He looks, same height, same clothing even, and he takes him in to his room on the first night because he's already seen him in the office. And when he enters the office, he sits right across from Goliadkin. And Goliadkin asks some of the office workers, didn't it strike you odd that guy looks just like me and even has the same name as I do? And they're all like, oh, well, we didn't notice. But now that you pointed out, yeah, it is kind of strange. And then goes back to work. It's that kind of mentality that's just work, work, work. And any kind of anomaly that shows up in your paradigm, whether it's a synchronicity or some sort of spiritual event, is just brushed aside. Doesn't really mean anything. It's just one of those deja vu things. And by the way, deja vu is actually a memory of a past life in which you experienced the exact same circumstances that you find yourself in. That's what a deja vu is. But such materialist types will brush that under the rug. Meanwhile, so the double does his job at the office better than he does. Constantly shows him up, gets accolades from everyone else in the office, and Goliadkin finds himself shrinking in esteem and eventually loses his job, of course, and he's completely replaced by his own double as the story ends. Now, it was interesting because when he published this, the literary critic named Belinsky, who was the most influential literary critic in Petersburg at the time when Poor Folk came out, he so praised it as the new Gogol. We have a new Gogol on our hands. That's because the novel was much more pseudomorphic, much more in line with French and English novels. And the moment he veers away from that towards a much more authentically, metaphysically intense novel like The Double, and it's about the same length as Poor Folk, short novel, about 150 pages, best read in one sitting so that you can get the full shotgun blast effect of it, of the metaphysics of it. And Belinsky didn't like it. He gave it a half-hearted review in the newspaper, and then the next story that he wrote, Mr. Prokharchin, was a short story that he wrote, which he roasted in the paper. And that short story is very interesting, Mr. Prokharchin. Now, first, before we get to that, The Double, it should be remarked, is one of the most influential narratives ever written, especially in popular culture. For those of you who know fantasy, sci-fi, horror, the writer Harlan Ellison has a version of it called Shatterday, which was then made into an episode of the reboot of The Twilight Zone with an 80s version of it where Bruce Willis plays the Goliadkin character, who's gradually replaced by his own double. And then, so that's lowbrow culture, but in highbrow culture with the great Portuguese novelist who died not that long ago, maybe a decade ago, I recommend everything he wrote. José Saramago has a novel called The Double, which was then made into a movie. I think there was another movie with the title The Double, so they had to change the title to Enemies. It's also very good. There have been other imitations of it as well. And it's interesting, too, maybe by some form of metaphysical convergence, that in the 1840s, Edgar Allan Poe was writing a story about a double called William Wilson, where there's a double there in that story that follows that character around. And it's hard to believe that neither one of these two authors read each other, but it doesn't appear so. I don't think that Dostoevsky could read English, and Poe certainly could not have read Russian. So it might be another case of these convergences, like with Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace coming up with the theory of natural selection, evolution by natural selection, or Newton and Leibniz both independently coming up with the calculus. Might have been one of those kinds of cultural things. So anyhow, so he puts this out, and everybody generally agrees that it's a flop, it's a failure, and it is awkward. Not as far as the story goes or the theme, but as far as the writing goes. This is a new writer. He's trying to figure out his game, so you've got to cut him some slack, especially in light of what he does later on, which alters the entire course of the history of Western literature. There's Dostoevsky before Western literature, and there's Dostoevsky after it, and it's not the same. He impacted it, both Russian and Eurofaustian, like a meteorite or a Tunguska cultural event. And then so Mr. Prokharchin is an interesting story about a man who's a miser, another one of these assessors and civil servants and so forth that, as Dostoevsky said, comes out of the overcoat. And a schlemiel guy. And he's nearing the end of his career, and he's a lodger staying in one of these things that we would nowadays call a bed and breakfast, I suppose, where you have a kitchen that is communal, meals are made, everybody shows up at the same time for the meal, and all live in independent rooms. And everyone makes fun of him. He is constantly, but on the other hand, he ridicules everyone else. He's constantly carping, fault-finding, never has a good word to say about anyone else, so of course no one's going to like you if that's your attitude. Of course not. And then so it gets to the point near the end of the story where he's sitting on his bed, lying on it, and he refuses to get out of it for some mysterious reason, because recently someone has, it's not even a room, he's just behind a partition, like one of those Asian fold-out partitions that you dress behind. That's his room. It's actually a corner of the kitchen. But somebody has gotten in there and gotten into his personal belongings, and now he feels invaded. So he won't get off of his bed, and then he gets sick, and everyone is standing around the bed, probably something like 12 lodgers plus the landlady. They're all standing around his bed as he dies. Now at this point, this image is an iconotype actually from European art. The German Renaissance painters did it the best. I think Hugo van der Goes has a good one, which is called, it's the iconotype of the lamentation for the death of the Virgin. So all the apostles are gathered around Mary's bed as she dies and her soul ascends to heaven. It's the same iconotype here, only it's done ironically and parodistically. I'm not even sure Dostoevsky knew that he was doing it. It may have been an unconscious thing, one of those Freudian, or I guess the better word for it is Jung's word, cryptomnesia, where you see something at some point, you forget about it, and then it comes up and you don't realize that you're unconsciously pulling it back out of your unconscious because you've already seen it somewhere before. So there's that, only it's done ironically and with a different theme, because with Hugo van der Goes, and Rudolf Steiner points this out in his lectures on European art, the whole point, when you look, by the time you get to, I think van der Goes' painting in the 16th century, by the time you get to his working of the iconotype, every single face of each apostle is totally unique, because it's about the West's metaphysical sublimation of the individual as a species, a metaphysical species unto him or herself. That's the West. And so that's the whole point of that iconotype being transformed, and it eventually gives rise to the portrait study of the random aristocrat, the random painter, and so forth. But they're not random, because in the West, everyone is unique. Everyone counts. Everyone matters. With Russia, it's not quite that way. Russia is midway in between, you might say. Russia is more individualistic than China, but way less individualistic than Europe. It's about the fraternal brotherhood, which is spread out on that symbol of the universal horizontal plane, where verticality is denied. They do have it. They have a whole system of counselors, I think 14 different grades of them. Each one gets more respect than the other. They have the bow in their culture. That's a Chinese and Japanese characteristic, the bow. You bow to everyone, and the more important the individual is, the deeper the bow goes, until you're all the way in front of the emperor, you're all the way down on the floor, touching your forehead to the floor. So the Russians do have the bow that Europeans seem to have gotten rid of very early on at some point. And the whole point of the story is this. This man has been a miser, and he has been lowballing everyone, and they all feel sorry for him. The landlady lets him pay a third of the rent that everyone else pays. Other people give him scraps of food from their plates. So they all are generally much more compassionate with him, despite their ridiculing of him, than he is with them. Anytime he's in a position to help someone, he doesn't bother. So he has sinned against the Russian Brotherhood, in other words. Keep that in mind, because that's what Crime and Punishment is about with Raskolnikov's murder. It's all about the sin against your fellow man. And the whole idea that we are all in this together is part of the Russian symbol, with its horizontal emphasis. Comrade. You call someone comrade because they're on a plane with you. An even plane, just as the Australian people, whom the British dumped there as prisoners onto Australia, call each other mate, to indicate that they're all on the same plane. No one's higher or lower than anyone else. They're all in this together. And so he has sinned against that. And that's the whole thing here, where the German version of the iconotype of the Lamentation of the Virgin is transformed into here a more suitably Russian version. So you can see Dostoevsky working through this pseudomorphosis. He's the one in whom you can actually track, starting with Pushkin, if you start there, where it's as strong as the literary European pseudomorphosis gets on any other civilization, I think. Russia's hit the hardest, I think. Japan much later, with characters like Mishima and Murakami and guys like that, who are also great writers imitating sort of Russian or European American literary styles. And so the last part of the story is that he dies there in that bed, and they all get in there and pull out his trunk from underneath it, go through it. There's nothing interesting in it. And then somebody sees a hole in the bottom of the bed, and then they start digging out wads of cash. Just a money machine, like they've hit it at Vegas, just pouring out of the mattress, something like 200,000 rubles, which back then was probably worth a couple of million, maybe something like that. So there's another iconotype here, although it's an archetype, not an iconotype in this case, which is to say it's universal, which is the dragon guarding the gold hoard. and also guarding the woman in the next story, the landlady. That's the case. Guarding the dragons guard gold and women, and they can't do anything with either one of them. They just want them. They're misers. So it's a sort of dragon slayer story, and there's all the gold that pours out in the form of all these rubles. So that's, and again, Belinsky made fun of this story because he's not understanding what Dostoevsky is doing. And it's not always the fault of people who are close to the genius, because as Hegel says, no man is a hero to his valet. Fine, Napoleon gets up. We've seen him every single morning. He's usually in a bad mood, and the valet it's Napoleon. It's not some hero. So it's sort of like that. We're too close to these people. And so you can't see their greatness until there's some perspective of time and possibly space as well, but definitely time, in order to contextualize properly the individual's achievements, which lie within the horizon of a broader whole of cultural achievements. And then so he writes The Landlady. So he goes through this period then in 1847-48 where he's concentrating on short fiction because he has to pay the bills, and he's selling all these stories to journals and newspapers and so forth. So then he works on these short stories. The one of which, my favorite of them, is The Landlady, which is out and out. He's left naturalism behind completely. And the story of The Landlady is told as though it were a dream. And Dostoevsky is very consciously, deliberately aware that you, the reader, are in a dream state. Everything that is happening is a dream. So it begins with this lonely character who's never had any friends, or let alone girlfriends, in his 20s. Basically a projection of Dostoevsky's ego. All these characters are variations of himself. And he's lonely, and he's going about looking for lodging. So he goes into a church where he sees this extraordinarily beautiful woman, who is later, he finds out her name is Katerina, with this old man whose name is Murin. And he becomes fascinated with them, and he follows them back to where they are. And he says he tells the porter, who is actually a Tatar, and that's significant that he's a Tatar, speaks a different language, and he asks, I would like to rent a room here. Is that possible? He bargains his way in, and they give him, here again, a corner with one of those Asian folding panels. And so he rents out a corner in this house with this very strange couple. And he falls immediately in love with the woman Katerina, and she reciprocates. She falls immediately in love with him, comes to visit him in his room, lies with him in bed. And keep in mind, it's just the division here is just there's no ceiling, so you got to be careful what kinds of noises you make in such situations like this. And so she tells him her life story, and the story turns out to be that this creepy old man who he may be a wizard or a shaman, he may have magical powers, Dostoevsky implies, who abducted her. So we have, once again, the Mongolian Siberian abduction archetype, which is actually universal, not just Russian and Chinese. So he has been having an affair with her mother, and she herself is the daughter from that affair, and her stepfather is not. He falls out of the picture, or it may be her biological father. He falls out of the picture. Murin shows up in a very Dracula-esque type scene, knocks on her window. She lets him in. He comes in through the window. It reminds me a lot of the dreamlike atmosphere of Werner Herzog's Nosferatu. I haven't seen the new one with Robert Eggers, but with that whole movie, you watch it, it's like you're in a dream. And the woman reminds me of the woman actress in that film who plays Mina von Barnhelm. Speaks as though she were hypnotized. And then says that he abducted her, carried her away, murdered her suitor, Alyosha, by shoving him out of a boat, and then wound up in this town, and she winds up living with him. And then Murin confronts him. So there's also a kind of Tristan, Isolde, King Mark archetype, where Isolde is King Mark's bride, and Tristan is her lover, who succeeds in absconding with her. It ends in tragedy, but he does successfully kidnap her. Now, this is a story of Dostoevsky's, one of his main iconotypes is the weak-hearted person, the faint-hearted person. This is not a character who is capable of an abduction at all. They have faint hearts, both of these lovers. And so, I won't tell you how it ends, but suffice it to say that he's incapable of an abduction in this particular case, unlike Murin with his strange supernatural powers. So that's the landlady. And then he spends 1847-48 writing several other stories. A couple of them are comic tales, trying to find his feet as a writer during this first period of 7 years of creativity from age 21, which is a Saturn, square Saturn, the last quarter of a Saturn cycle. It's every 7 years. So from point of birth at age 7, it's Saturn square Saturn. It's a 90-degree angle. Then at age 14, it's in opposition to itself. And then finally the third quarter comes at age 21, when it's the last 7 years of that first Saturn cycle that he begins writing in during this period. And it ends with imprisonment with a kind of a Saturnian punctuation mark. And then then he gets around to writing another novel, or at least attempting to write a full-blown novel. Natachka Nezvanyova is the name of the novel. And he left it unfinished because he got arrested. But what's there, I've read it, and it's excellent. It was really, really good. He never went back and finished it because it has certain structural problems to it. But it's told from the first-person viewpoint of a woman, which is fresh in Dostoevsky. To get a female protagonist, he usually does not have female protagonists. In this case, he does, and it works very well. And she tells her autobiography of what it's like growing up under this very abusive situation with her parents. She doesn't like her mother. Her father's dead, so she has a stepfather who's a failed violinist who can't get his career going. And it's Dostoevsky worried about whether he can get his own career going as an artist, literary artist again, or not. And so this character is a failed musician. He thinks he's an unrecognized genius, and that sooner or later everybody's going to find out what a great genius he is. But she falls in love with her father, who's her stepfather, and falls in love with him, and then it goes from there. It tells her all kinds of rough adventures that she has. Then Dostoevsky had been associating, this is 1849, I think in 1848 he had been associating with a socialist group of revolutionaries and their printing press. And I think Tsar Nicholas found out about it and rounded them all up. Him and 23 other people rounded them all up, arrested them, put them in jail. And then they were going to be killed in a firing squad, so they put all 23 people out in front of a firing squad. They all raised their rifles, and the order was even given to fire. And then there's a deus ex machina who comes out. At the last minute, there's a reprieve. This is coming from Tsar Nicholas I. So instead, he's given a lighter sentence to spend 4 years in a Siberian prison in Omsk, which is out in God knows where in Siberia, for 4 years in which he does no writing, which, as I say, is a surprise because so many great works of literature have come out of people who have made good use of their time in jail by reading books, which the officials usually don't have any objections. But he's one who will behave. He's not going to be one of these problem prisoners. Malcolm X writes his autobiography in prison. Marco Polo, who does the same thing, tells about his travels. Machiavelli also wrote The Prince in jail, and so forth. But not the case with Dostoevsky. He doesn't write anything during those 4 years, but he does when he gets out. And he gets out in 1854, and he's back in the military at that time for a while. And then he meets his first wife, right about that time, 1854-55. The first thing he writes when he comes out of prison is a short comic novel called The Village at Stepanchikovo, and a short story called Uncle's Dream. Then he writes The House of the Dead, which we'll get into in class, which is his autobiographical account of what it was like to spend those 4 years in that prison around all these tough guys and how he survived. I'm looking forward to reading that. I haven't read it yet. And then not too long after that will come the first of the greats, Notes from Underground, 1864. At the time when America's involved in a civil war, Dostoevsky's producing his first masterpieces, 1865, Crime and Punishment. And here he's right around age 40, and in astrology, this is your Uranus, opposite Uranus breakthrough period, which lasts anywhere between the ages of 38 and 44-ish. Right in there, I think he's 44 when he publishes Crime and Punishment. That's the breakthrough. Then writes a short novel called The Gambler. And it's pretty much one masterpiece after the next from that point on, just one after the next. All right, so we'll stop there. We've got plenty to discuss here in class tomorrow. See you then. Oh, keep in mind, I still do astrology readings. For those of you who are interested, hit me up at johndavidebert@gmail.com for more information. And I also do tutoring as well.